In historical perspective, the rise in executive pay in the United States has been staggering. This graph shows trends in executive pay since the 1930s, with all dollar values adjusted for inflation. In the 1930s, executive compensation was relatively modest. At the median, the middle point at which half of all executives earn more and half earn less, annual compensation was about $70,000, the equivalent, shown here, of about $850,000 today. For the richest 10% of American executives, annual compensation was about double that, around $1.8 million. For the next generation, running into the middle 1970s, executive pay grew at a modest rate. Indeed, the median and richest executive salaries in the 1970s, at $930,000 and $1.84 million respectively, were not much different than they'd been in the 1930s. But beginning in the late 1970s, lax corporate regulation allowed executives to line their own pockets with lucrative stock options, deferred compensation, and lavish pensions. Over the next 30 years, median executive compensation grew more than fourfold, to over $4 million, while compensation for the richest executives grew almost tenfold, to over $17 million a year. This trend is even more revealing if we relate it to the more modest fortunes of working Americans. Over the same era in which executive compensation has ballooned, median wages and median incomes for all Americans have stagnated. This graph shows the ratio between CEO compensation and the average salary of production workers. Each hard hat is equal to the average pay of 10 of those production workers, and they're stacked up to equal the average CEO compensation for that year. In 1966, for example, the average CEO took home a salary equal to that of about 24 production workers. In the 1970s, this ratio began to grow, pushing past 50 to 1 in the early 1980s, and past 100 to 1 by the end of that decade. Reliance on stocks and stock options made CEO pay somewhat vulnerable to recessionary dips in the market, but the trend was dramatic and unmistakable. A generation ago, CEO salaries were about 25 times the salary of the average worker. Now, CEO salaries average closer to 250 times the salary of the average worker.